Morning haze hangs over the water at Invergordon, on the northeast coast of Scotland, where a 4-engine flying boat sits fueled and waiting. The date reads, the 25th of August, 1942. Up the gangway climbs Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of a dead king and brother to the reigning one, wearing the uniform of an RAF Air Commodore on a flight the Air Ministry has logged as routine. He turns 39 that year. Far to the south, in a quiet house in Buckinghamshire, his wife rocks their third child, a boy not yet 7 weeks old, with no idea that the next few hours will turn her into a widow before her 36th birthday. The aircraft climbs into low cloud at 1:30. Roughly 30 minutes later, it strikes a hillside called Eagle's Rock, near Dunbeath, killing almost everyone aboard. The woman in Buckinghamshire answers to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, and the telephone call that reaches her that evening erases, in a single sentence, the one steady thing she has assembled across 35 years of upheaval. So, who stood behind the widow's veil? This woman the newspapers would photograph in black for years afterward. Britain in 1942 knew Marina as the most fashionable figure in the country, a continental beauty who arrived 8 years earlier, trailing Parisian couture, and a sapphire the size of a postage stamp. A harder biography sat behind that picture. Before she ever walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, she lost a country, watched her family slide from palaces into rented rooms, and learned that several of her closest relatives died against a Russian cellar wall. The glamour ran genuine. The ground beneath it never held firm for a single day of her life. She came into the world in Athens on the 13th of December, 1906, the youngest of 3 sisters in a family that occupied one of the strangest positions in European royalty. Her father, Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark, painted canvases and worried about money in roughly equal measure. Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia, her mother, carried the cold grandeur of the Romanov court into a Greek palace that often felt more like a stage set than a fortress. 2 girls came before her. Olga and Elizabeth preceded Marina by 3 and 2 years, so the youngest entered a household that no longer hoped for a son. Trace the bloodlines, and the picture turns dizzying. Through her father, Marina descended from King George I of Greece, and, beyond him, from King Christian IX of Denmark, the patriarch whose children married into half the thrones of the continent. Through her mother, she reached back to Emperor Alexander II of Russia. Because Grand Duchess Elena counted as a first cousin of Tsar Nicholas II, that same bloodline tied the little girl in Athens to the Tsar as his first cousin once removed. One more connection mattered for the future. Her father's brother, Prince Andrew, fathered a boy named Philip, which bound Marina and the eventual Duke of Edinburgh as first cousins who would spend decades watching each other navigate the same foreign court. On paper, this looked like security stacked on security, a child wrapped in more crowns than most countries ever produced. The Greek throne told a different story. King George I arrived as a Danish prince imported to rule a nation that barely knew him, planted on a seat that mobs, parliaments, and rival politicians regarded as removable furniture. Coups, assassinations, and forced abdications ran through Greek royal history like a recurring fever. In 1913, a gunman murdered King George I in the street at Thessaloniki, and the family learned again what it already suspected, that the palace doors could lock from the outside at any moment. The 3 sisters grew up as a tight unit, schooled together, dressed alike, and shuttled between Athens and the estates of their grander Russian relations. Olga, the eldest, carried the seriousness of a future matriarch, while Elizabeth held the quieter middle ground, and Marina, the baby, learned early how to charm a room without seeming to try. Their world ran on languages. They slid between Greek, English, French, and Russian without thinking about it, the careless multilingualism of children whose family tree crossed every border on the map. None of them could have guessed how far that fluency would carry them, into marriages that would later deposit one sister in Yugoslavia, one in Bavaria, and Marina herself in Britain. Holidays carried the sisters across a continent of relatives. They summered at Russian estates, wintered in the warmth of the Mediterranean, and learned the geography of European royalty the way other children learn a neighborhood. The grandeur masked a fragility nobody named aloud. Every grand house they visited belonged to a dynasty that war or revolution would soon test, and a perceptive girl could feel the ground shifting under all of it long before any adult chose to say so. Marina grew up inside that uncertainty without fully grasping it. Servants moved through warm rooms, tutors arrived on schedule, and the household ran with the easy confidence of people who assumed the arrangement would last. It would not. The forces that would scatter the family already gathered across Europe, in trenches and parliaments far from the Athens she knew, and the first of her many exiles waited only a few years ahead. The First World War tore the Greek royal house apart from the inside. King Constantine I, Marina's uncle, wanted neutrality, while his prime minister and much of the country wanted to join the Allies, and the quarrel escalated until foreign powers and domestic enemies forced Constantine off the throne in 1917. Marina turned 11 that year. The whole extended family packed what it could and left, first for Switzerland, then for Paris, joining a flood of dethroned and frightened royalty washing across Western Europe. Exile sounds romantic until you examine the accounts. The British royals, whatever their troubles, kept their estates and their certainty. The Greek and Russian branches lost nearly everything, and Prince Nicholas, a Grand Duke's son-in-law and a king's brother, suddenly faced the question of how a man with no realm pays a Paris rent. His answer carried a quiet dignity the family rarely advertised. He painted, sold his canvases, and signed many of them not as a prince of Greece but under the plain working pseudonym Nicolas le Prince, so buyers would judge the brushwork rather than the bloodline. Those canvases found buyers. A displaced prince fed his daughters by turning, for practical purposes, into a jobbing artist with a clever false name. Worse news traveled west in 1918. In a cellar in Yekaterinburg, Bolshevik guards shot Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children, then murdered other Romanovs across Russia in the weeks that followed. These killings never read as distant headlines to Marina. The Tsar counted as her mother's first cousin. The murdered Grand Dukes and Duchesses belonged to her own family tree, as aunts and cousins by blood and marriage. And the news filtering into the Paris émigré community carried names the family once spoke at dinner. She learned exactly how easily a royal title ended in a basement. Grand Duchess Elena answered the catastrophe in the only way that seemed to steady her. She opened an orphanage and a nursery school in Paris for the children of Russian refugees, the sons and daughters of officers and aristocrats who fled with nothing, and she put her own daughters to work inside it. Marina helped there as a girl, sorting clothes, minding younger children, watching adults who once commanded estates now stand in line for charity. The experience left a residue her later glamour never quite covered. She understood, in a way most British princesses never needed to, exactly how fast a comfortable life could collapse and how little the world owed you once it did. Paris, in the 1920s, held a whole shadow aristocracy of the dispossessed. Former Grand Dukes drove taxis for a living, countesses took in sewing, and officers of the old Imperial Russian Army carried plates in restaurants that traded on their fallen glamour. The Greek and Russian relations Marina grew up among belonged to that twilight society, a community bound by shared catastrophe and a stubborn refusal to admit how far it dropped. They kept the manners. The money vanished, and the gap between the gentility they preserved and the wealth they lost produced a strain a sharp child could not miss. Marina watched grown adults perform the rituals of a class history already evicted, and she stored the lesson somewhere permanent. Many of the Russian exiles traveled on so-called Nansen passports, the stopgap documents the League of Nations issued to refugees whom no country would claim, and the indignity of that scrap of paper announced their position more bluntly than any sad memoir ever could. Marina's branch held a slightly better hand than the stateless Russians, since the Greek connection granted them somewhere to belong on paper. The difference ran thin. She grew up watching the people closest to her reduced to wards of an international committee, their grandeur worth less than a valid travel document, and the murders in Yekaterinburg hung over all of it as proof that the alternative to exile could turn far worse than a hard chair in a Paris flat. By her late teens, Marina grew into something Europe recognized at a glance: a beautiful, well-bred, and dangerously poor princess. The looks turned heads, the pedigree opened doors, and the empty bank account closed a few of them again. In the marriage market of the 1920s and early 30s, that combination raised her value and her vulnerability in the same breath. Royal families hunting for elegance noticed her. So did her own relatives, who understood from hard experience that a brilliant match alone might keep Marina off a permanent slide into genteel obscurity, the fate that swallowed so many of their exiled friends. Prince George of the United Kingdom carried a reputation the modern royal household has spent decades trying to manage. Born in December 1902, the fourth son of King George V and Queen Mary, he grew into the cleverest and most charming of the brothers, fond of music, art, fast cars, and the kind of London nightlife that drove his father to migraines. Serious historians no longer flinch at the broad outline of his wild youth. George experimented with drugs and struggled at one point with an addiction severe enough to alarm his family. He also conducted romantic and sexual relationships with both men and women, in an era when the second half of that sentence could end a man's career or his liberty. The rumors of a long affair with the playwright Noel Coward rest on gossip rather than any primary source, and careful biographers treat them as unproven. The documents support something messier and more human than the tidy scandal: a gifted prince with real talents and real demons, whom his family hoped a steadying marriage might rescue. They did not want a saint for him. They needed an anchor, someone with enough poise and pedigree to absorb the rough edges and show a respectable face to the public. Marina met George in London in 1932, and the courtship gathered momentum 2 years later during an August house party at Bled Castle in Yugoslavia. Among the cousins and connections that bound European royalty together, the match suited everyone, for different reasons. The Windsors gained a wife of impeccable blood who might calm their wildest son. Marina gained security, a throne-adjacent future, and an escape from the precariousness that shadowed her since childhood. Romance and arithmetic pointed the same direction, which in royal marriages happened less often than the public liked to imagine. The Yugoslav setting owed nothing to accident. Marina's eldest sister Olga married Prince Paul of Yugoslavia, which handed the Greek sisters a foothold in Balkan royal society and a steady rotation of grand house parties where eligible princes circulated. Bled Castle, set above its alpine lake, supplied the discreet, high-born backdrop in which a courtship could ripen far from the London press. George arrived as a guest. He left, in effect, spoken for, and the machinery of a royal wedding cranked into motion within weeks of his return to England. What kind of husband Marina actually acquired remains a genuinely complicated question. George combined real charm and real talent with appetites that alarmed his family for years, and the marriage the Windsors arranged as a cure did not magically dissolve a lifetime of habits. By most surviving accounts, the two reached a partnership that worked, affectionate and companionable, with Marina supplying the steadiness the family ordered. Nobody mistook it for a flawless union. They built something durable out of imperfect materials, two clever people who understood the terms of the bargain and turned it into a working partnership, which, among the royal marriages of the period, counted as a quiet success rather than a disappointment. The couple married on the 29th of November 1934 at Westminster Abbey, followed by a second ceremony in the Greek Orthodox Rite in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace, a nod to the bride's faith and her Athenian origins. One small detail carries a long shadow. Marina remains the last foreign-born princess to marry into the British royal family. Every royal bride since came, in some meaningful sense, from home soil, which leaves Marina the closing chapter of a centuries-old practice of importing continental princesses to refresh the dynasty's blood. The public reaction bordered on hysteria. Britain, in 1934, sat deep in economic gloom. Unemployment lines stretched through industrial towns, and into that grey mood walked a princess dressed by the great Paris houses with a confidence the British aristocracy could not fake. Crowds wanted to see her. Newspapers chronicled her wardrobe in obsessive detail, and a particular shade of blue-green she favored swept through London dress shops under the name Marina Blue. Her engagement ring, a cashmere sapphire set by Cartier, launched its own small fashion stampede. For a country starved of color, Marina supplied it by the trunkload, and the monarchy discovered that glamour, deployed well, could work as a tool of statecraft. The wedding itself ran like a piece of national theater. Crowds packed the route to Westminster Abbey on a cold November morning, and the congregation inside gathered a roster of European royalty that would never reassemble in such numbers, because within a decade war and revolution would scatter or extinguish half the houses sitting in those pews. After the Anglican service, the couple repeated their vows in Greek at a second, Orthodox ceremony in the chapel at Buckingham Palace, a touch that pleased the bride and reminded the room she came from a church older than the one she married into. Newsreel cameras caught all of it. For a few hours, a country ground down by depression could watch a fairy tale play out on the screen, and the monarchy quietly banked the affection for the leaner years it already felt coming. Marina's influence on British fashion outlasted the wedding by years. Designers courted her, magazines tracked her hemlines, and shopgirls copied her hats within a season of each appearance. Because a princess who dressed with Paris instinct rather than dutiful English restraint handed the public something to imitate. She grasped the power of the image and wielded it deliberately. A well-cut coat and a confident entrance, she understood, performed real work for a monarchy that needed the public on its side, and she supplied both without ever appearing to strain for effect. Photographers chased her down every street. The woman who learned thrift in an émigré flat now set the terms of glamour for an entire country, and the irony of that reversal would have amused her if she ever paused long enough to notice it. For about 8 years, the story let Marina breathe. The Duke and Duchess of Kent settled into a London house at 3 Belgrave Square and a country home called Coppins in Buckinghamshire, and they produced the modern, photogenic face the monarchy wanted all along. Their first child, Prince Edward, arrived in October 1935 and would grow up to become the present Duke of Kent. A daughter, Princess Alexandra, followed on Christmas Day 1936, born into a year when the abdication of her uncle Edward VIII threw the whole family into crisis. Marina handled the strange machinery of the British court with more skill than anyone expected from an outsider. She built a genuine bond with her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, a woman whose disapproval could freeze a room and who did not hand out warmth lightly. That bond surprised the household. The two shared something real beneath the formality. Both held that royal blood carried obligations, and that duty came before comfort. Queen Mary respected Marina's flawless ancestry in a way she never quite extended to in laws she regarded as commoners, and Marina returned the respect with a loyalty that lasted. The abdication crisis of 1936 rearranged the family around the Kents in ways that touched them directly. Edward VIII, the charming eldest brother, surrendered the throne that December to marry the American divorcee Wallis Simpson, and the crown fell to the shy, stammering second brother, who became King George VI almost against his will. Overnight, the Duke of Kent shifted closer to the center of the dynasty, a younger brother of the reigning king rather than a glamorous fourth son with no path to power. Marina's standing rose with her husband's. The easy decade of nightclubs and Paris frocks acquired a heavier frame, because the monarchy now leaned on the remaining brothers to project calm after a scandal that rattled the institution to its roots. Daily life at Coppins kept its gentle rhythm a while longer. The house in Buckinghamshire wrapped the children in a green, ordinary childhood of dogs and gardens, a deliberate softness Marina valued after her own jagged start. She wanted her son and daughter to keep the security the world once denied her. Photographs from those years show a handsome, modern family at ease, the picture of a monarchy that survived its scare and learned to look relaxed in front of a lens. The clock kept running, though. War arrived in September 1939. George pulled on an Air Force uniform, the men of the household vanished into the fight, and the gentle rhythm of Coppins fell silent for the duration. Their third child, Prince Michael, arrived on the 4th of July, 1942, into a wartime Britain and a family weeks away from breaking apart. Marina now mothered 3 children under a darkening sky, her husband in uniform and often away. The Garden Party monarchy of the 1930s belonged to another world by then. 7 weeks after Michael's birth, a flying boat lifted off the water at Invergordon, and the gentlest chapter of Marina's life ended in a sentence delivered down a telephone line. The flight carried a mundane purpose, an inspection and morale visit to British forces in Iceland. 14 of the 15 men aboard died at Eagle's Rock, and a single rear gunner walked away from the wreck as the only human witness to the Duke's final minutes. Investigators pieced the route together as well as they could. The flying boat climbed into cloud after takeoff and somehow ended up over high ground inland, when its planned course should have held it safely out over the water the whole way. Why a competent crew wandered so far off track in such weather has never resolved itself with full certainty. The official RAF Court of Inquiry, whose records later reached the National Archives at Kew through declassification, settled on a grim and unglamorous conclusion. The crew committed a serious navigational error, descending or holding a course that put a low-flying aircraft into high ground hidden by cloud, and the foul weather sealed the outcome. No sabotage, no enemy action, no cinematic villain. A trained crew read the geography wrong in conditions that punished any mistake without mercy. That answer has never satisfied everyone, which is how conspiracy theories breed. Over the decades, popular speculation insisted that the pilot drank himself useless, that the Duke himself seized the controls and flew the plane into the hill, or that the whole affair concealed an assassination dressed as an accident. Examine the primary evidence, and these stories evaporate. None of them survives contact with the inquiry records, the witness accounts, or simple physics, and they persist mainly because a royal death in wartime fog feels as though it ought to hide a secret. Sometimes the dullest explanation also proves the correct one, and a fatal navigational error in bad weather amounts, by any honest reading, to what killed Prince George. Strip away the inquiry and the theories, and a simpler scene remains at the bottom of it. Somewhere in Buckinghamshire, on a warm August evening, a woman of 35 answered a telephone and learned that the father of her 3 children, including the infant still nursing in the next room, burned to death on a Scottish hill. Marina survived exile, revolution, and the slaughter of her relatives. None of it prepared her for this particular call. The most photographed wife in Britain turned, in the space of a sentence, into the kind of young war widow the country produced by the thousand that year, except that hers arrived wrapped in a uniform and a state funeral that rendered the private grief no easier to carry. For Marina, the cause hardly mattered against the fact. Her husband vanished at 39, she herself reached 35, and the baby in her arms still knew nothing of her face. The most stylish couple in Britain collapsed into a young widow and 3 children, the youngest of whom would grow up with no memory of his father at all. Buckingham Palace draped itself in mourning, the newsreels ran their solemn footage, and the public grieved a charming prince killed in service. Behind the cameras, the practical cruelties only began to assemble, and the next blow would come not from the weather but from the treasury. Grief bought Marina no mercy from the British state, and the first insult arrived wrapped in bureaucratic language. A question surfaced almost immediately over how to classify the Duke's final flight. If the trip counted as active service, his estate qualified for the standard wartime exemption from death duties, the heavy taxes that fell on inherited wealth and could swallow a fortune in a single stroke. If it counted instead as a welfare mission, a morale visit rather than a combat operation, no exemption applied. Officials weighed the 2 definitions and chose the one that cost the widow more. The The government ruled it a welfare mission and sent the bill. The royal biographer, Hugo Vickers, later sharpened the episode into a famous line, calling Marina the only war widow in Britain whose estate paid death duties. He exaggerated, and he knew it. Underneath the flourish ran a real cruelty. A young widow of the royal house, her husband dead in the king's uniform, learned that his death did not fit the category that would have spared her a punishing tax. The ruling battered her finances at the exact moment she could least absorb it, and it carried a flavor of official indifference the family never forgot. A lesser woman might have retreated into mourning and let the world manage without her. Marina chose the opposite. During the war years, she trained as a nurse and worked under the plain pseudonym Sister K, serving with the Civil Nursing Reserve at University College Hospital in London while the bombs fell. A princess of Greece and Denmark, cousin to murdered czars and now a duchess of the British realm, scrubbed in on a hospital ward under a false name, emptying bedpans and dressing wounds beside ordinary nurses who never suspected that the quiet, capable woman among them ranked among the most photographed people in the country. Set the two halves of her wartime life side by side. On one side sat the state, which buried her husband as a hero with one hand and presented her with his tax bill with the other. On the other side stood Marina, who answered that coldness not with a public word of complaint, but with unpaid anonymous shifts on a hospital ward while the bombs came down. She owed the country nothing after that treatment. She lent it her hands regardless, night after night under a false name, because duty ran in her too deep to switch off, and because work always carried her family through catastrophe. The pseudonym carried no vanity in reverse. It let her work without the chaos that Duchess of Kent would have triggered on a hospital floor, and it fit a pattern that ran through her whole life. The same instinct that once led her father to sign his canvases, Nicholas le Prince. When the family needed to function in the ordinary world, they took ordinary names and pressed on. Marina grew up watching displaced royalty learn to survive by usefulness rather than rank, and now, widowed and squeezed by the treasury, she fell back on exactly that training. She would not perform helplessness for anyone. Widowhood brought a slower humiliation that no single decision could explain away, because the money simply stopped. As the Duke's widow, Marina lost the civil list income that supported the household while George lived, and the death duties already opened a hole in the estate. The arithmetic of a great royal establishment, with its staff, its two houses, and its obligations, no longer balanced. Something cracked first, and the contents of her husband's life paid the bill. In March 1947, the auction house Christie's held a sale of possessions from the Kent estate, and the public watched a princess liquidate her dead husband's belongings to keep her household afloat. For a woman who treated appearances as duty, the spectacle stung. Strangers bid on objects that filled her married home, and the press reported it with the mixture of sympathy and appetite that royal misfortune always seems to provoke. The most fashionable bride of the 1930s now turned up in the financial pages as a vendor of inherited treasures. Set the 1947 sale against its moment, and the irony bites. Britain that year still queued under rationing. The empire already began to unwind, and the royal family busied itself preparing the wedding of the young Princess Elizabeth to Prince Philip, Marina's own first cousin. While the dynasty rehearsed a celebration, one of its widows quietly sold off her late husband's belongings to keep her household solvent. The press handled the sale with visible awkwardness. Few images unsettle the public more than a royal house that can mount a dazzling wedding for one member, while another empties her cabinets to pay the wages of her staff. Marina suffered a sharp downgrade by royal standards, not a descent into real poverty, and that difference matters. She kept both her roof and her rank, settling into a sprawling grace and favor apartment at Kensington Palace, renovated to a standard most of her countrymen would have envied. The word poverty never honestly applied. What change sat lower than survival? She now tracked expenses her wealthier in-laws never thought about, trimmed a household that once ran without restraint, and carried the permanent awareness of a woman knocked down the staircase of fortune more than once, who knew precisely how the fall felt. She kept up appearances anyway, and only the account books knew how carefully she now financed that elegance. That composure became her trademark. She buried a husband, paid a tax that felt like an insult, and auctioned his possessions in public, and through all of it she declined to play the grieving martyr for the cameras. The girl who once helped run a refugee orphanage in Paris knew the difference between hardship and self-pity, and she refused to confuse the two on her own behalf. The Crown, having taken a great deal from her, now discovered that it could keep asking her for more, and that she would keep saying yes. The second half of Marina's life settled into the steady labor of a working royal who decided that usefulness held the only dignity left worth defending. She turned herself into one of the monarchy's most reliable ambassadors abroad, the figure the Crown sent when it needed grace and gravity at a difficult ceremony. The Crown trusted her with the hard ones. In 1957, she represented the Queen at the independence celebrations of Ghana, and in 1966, she repeated the role in Botswana, standing in for the sovereign as the British Empire dismantled itself colony by colony. A princess who personally lost one throne now presided, with perfect poise, over the orderly surrender of distant ones. These journeys carried a symmetry that nobody at the ceremonies thought to mention. Marina entered the world inside a monarchy that the Greek people rejected, recalled, and rejected again, a crown that never rested securely on any head for long. Now she crossed the world for the British crown to preside, graciously, over other nations choosing to rule themselves. She understood what it meant for a flag to come down. The girl who fled Athens at 11 stood on platforms in Accra and Gaborone, applauding the orderly retreat of an empire, with the calm of someone who watched thrones fall since before she could spell the word. To the wider British public, though, Marina belonged to a gentler arena. For 26 years, she presided over the All England Lawn Tennis and Croquet Club as its president, which planted her at the center of Wimbledon every summer as its calm, elegant presence, the woman who handed out the trophies and embodied the tournament's old-world manners. Generations who knew nothing of Eagle's Rock or the death duties or the Paris orphanage simply knew her as the Duchess at the tennis. A strange afterlife awaited a Romanov cousin who presided over strawberries in serve and volley, and she filled the role for a quarter of a century without a visible misstep. A woman who outlived two monarchies handed silver cups to sweating tennis players every July, and the crowds adored her without once guessing what stood behind the poise. Her place inside the royal family carried its own quiet tensions, mostly because Marina never stopped believing that blood ranked people. She held to the old hierarchies with a conviction that could chill a room. Royals who married commoners earned her private disdain, and that disdain reportedly stretched even to the Scottish family of the Queen Mother, whose comparatively ordinary origins Marina regarded as a dilution of the royal line. Her relationship with Queen Elizabeth II stayed respectful and correct, yet it could stiffen whenever these questions of rank surfaced. Toward one relative, however, she showed nothing but warmth. She championed her first cousin, Prince Philip, as he found his footing in the British court, recognizing in him a fellow exile from the wreck of the Greek monarchy, another displaced child of Athens, who landed, against the odds, near the top of the British establishment. Marina worked almost to the end. In the summer of 1968, her health failed, and doctors found a brain tumor, a diagnosis that reached the public only in the final stretch before it killed her. She died at Kensington Palace on the 27th of August, 1968, at 61. The same apartment that sheltered her careful widowhood held her last hours. 3 days later, they buried her at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, folding the last foreign-born princess of the British line into English soil beside the family she joined in 1934. The newspapers that once obsessed over her Paris wardrobe ran their obituaries, and the public mourned a figure who belonged to the national furniture for 34 years. Her children carried the family forward in their different ways. Prince Edward succeeded his father as Duke of Kent, and would, in time, take up the same Wimbledon presidency his mother turned into a fixture, a quiet inheritance of duty handed down from one generation to the next. Princess Alexandra grew into one of the hardest-working and best-liked figures in the royal house. Prince Michael, the baby who never knew his father, built a life on the quieter edges of the family's official world. The dynasty Marina married into in 1934 absorbed her bloodline completely, and the Greek princess with the Romanov cousins dissolved into the ordinary continuity of the British royal family. Weigh the whole arc, and a hard pattern emerges. Marina lost her country at 11, her relatives to a Russian seller before she turned 13, her husband to a Scottish hillside at 35, and a chunk of her fortune to a treasury ruling and an auctioneer's hammer in the years that followed. She met each blow with the same refusal to complain, the same instinct to make herself useful, the same composure she learned in a Paris refugee school watching adults rebuild their lives from nothing. History remembers her as the woman who brought continental elegance to a grey monarchy, and that holds true as far as it goes. The harder story sits underneath the couture. Every loss handed her a reason to break, and she denied the public the satisfaction of watching her do it, while a brain tumor took her at 61 before old age ever could.